Night settled over the palace like a quiet vow. Candles glimmered along the corridors of Hampton Court, their flames bending in the still air. The Queen slept behind gilded doors, her prayers unfinished, her hope for an heir fading with every breath. Yet somewhere else within those same walls, destiny stirred in silence. Among the young attendants of Queen Catherine of Aragon was a girl of 16, Elizabeth Blount. She had no powerful lineage, no grand ambition, only a calm grace that made people trust her without knowing why. Her laughter was soft, her eyes steady, and in a court drowning in calculation, that innocence shone like forbidden light. King Henry VIII saw her first during a feast where music drowned the whispers of politics. He was still young then, proud and radiant, but already haunted by the absence of a son. Every failed pregnancy of the Queen echoed like a judgment from God, and doubt gnawed at the edges of his faith. When his gaze met Elizabeth's, it was not the hunger of a lover that passed between them, but the desperate recognition of a man seeking proof that heaven had not cursed his bloodline. The affair began not with passion, but with silence. A candle dimmed, a door closed, and the weight of an empire hung in the air between them. For one brief moment, Henry forgot he was a king, and she forgot she was meant to serve a queen. Outside, the night wind brushed the curtains of Catherine's chamber. In the room beyond, laughter broke through the quiet, light as a bell and dangerous as prophecy. It was the sound of sin breathing for the first time. If you believe history hides its cruelest truths behind royal walls, stay and subscribe to our channel, where every silence tells a story. Rumors moved through the corridors of Whitehall like smoke in a locked room. Servants spoke in whispers, careful not to meet each other's eyes. They said it was no accident that Elizabeth Blount had caught the attention of King Henry VIII. Behind every glance, behind every meeting arranged under the pretext of music or courtly lessons, there was a plan born from silence. The men who feared the Queen's growing influence had found their weapon not in soldiers or swords, but in a girl of soft voice and quiet faith. Let the girl prove what the Queen cannot, they said, and the fate of England will change. King Henry VIII never spoke of it openly. In public, he called himself a loyal husband, a man devoted to Catherine of Aragon and to God. Yet at night, his doubts grew louder than his prayers. Every time he entered the chapel, the crucifix above the altar seemed to watch him with cold eyes. The absence of a male heir felt heavier than sin itself, and the thought of another failure pressed against his chest like a stone. When Elizabeth's belly began to swell, the court learned to pretend not to see. The Queen continued her duties, her smile growing thinner each day, while the king's advisors moved quietly behind her back. Priests were called in secret to bless the unborn child, their hands trembling as they whispered prayers not meant to be heard. In the kingdom's heart, faith and ambition shared the same bed. Then came the night of the storm. Rain struck the palace windows, and thunder rolled like judgment. In a chamber far from the royal rooms, Elizabeth Blount labored in the dim light of a single candle. When the cry of the newborn filled the air, the servants crossed themselves, too afraid to rejoice. Outside, church bells began to ring, their sound swallowed by the rain. The king arrived before dawn. He stood beside the bed, pale and silent, his gaze fixed on the child. Slowly, he lifted the boy in his arms, studying the tiny face as if it were a message from heaven. "My blood lives," he murmured. And in that moment, he proved to himself what the Queen could not, that his seed was still blessed. Yet in doing so, he broke the very faith he claimed to serve. By morning, Elizabeth Blount was gone from the palace. The carriages left without fanfare, wheels sinking into the mud of the courtyard. She was sent away to the countryside, her name spoken only in whispers, her purpose fulfilled. Behind her, the bells still echoed through the rain, marking not a celebration, but the quiet exile of the woman who had given birth to a throne. The boy grew beneath a roof of gold and prayer. From the first months of his life, servants bowed before him as if he carried more than mortal blood. They called him Henry FitzRoy, the son of the king, though never the Prince of England. He was the living proof that the crown could still create life, a child born from sin yet bathed in royal grace. His cradle was carved from oak sent by the king himself, his clothes embroidered with the colors of the Tudor rose. As he grew, tutors arrived from every corner of the realm. Latin, scripture, chivalry, the art of command, all were poured into the boy as if he were being shaped for a destiny greater than anyone dared to name. He learned to ride before he could write, his small hands gripping the reins, while courtiers watched in uneasy silence. For each gift he received, another man at court whispered against him. For every honor, another noble clenched his teeth in envy. The shadow of his existence fell across the Queen's household like an insult that refused to fade. King Henry VIII loved the boy with a pride that frightened even his closest advisors. He saw in him not only his reflection, but also his redemption, the answer to every doubt that had haunted his faith. Yet behind that love lingered a quiet hatred. FitzRoy reminded him of a truth he could not face, that the purest act of his reign had come from sin, and that God had granted success to the bed he should have never entered. Each time the boy smiled, Henry saw his own defiance smiling back. Far from court, Elizabeth Blount lived among the fields of Lincolnshire. Letters came from the palace wrapped in silk, carrying gifts and gold coins. They called them tokens of gratitude, but she knew what they truly were: payments for silence. She opened them with hands that no longer trembled, read the words written by servants, never by the king himself, and folded them away in a wooden chest. Sometimes she would hear news of her son, of the titles granted to him, of the feasts where the king called him Duke of Richmond. She would close her eyes and imagine him standing before the court, tall and proud, unaware that every cheer for his name erased another piece of hers. The glory of her child had become the tomb of her memory. In the palace, the boy walked among men who would never forgive the way he had come into the world. In the countryside, his mother walked among ghosts who would never forget it. Between them stretched a silence deeper than love, held together by pride, guilt, and the slow understanding that one would rise only because the other had vanished. Queen Catherine of Aragon endured betrayal not with fire, but with silence. In the great halls where she once ruled beside her husband, she now walked like a shadow draped in velvet. Her heart had not hardened, only slowed, as if each beat carried the weight of prayers unanswered. Yet within her calm, something colder began to take shape. She would not scream or curse, but she would let the world see what sin had done to a king. When word of Henry FitzRoy's rising honor reached her, Catherine gathered her priests and counselors. She spoke softly, her voice like the slow pull of a blade beneath silk. "The child," she said, "was not a gift from heaven, but a mockery of it. To bless him was to bless defiance. To raise him was to wound the faith that crowned England." Her message spread through the court and across the sea to Rome, carried by men who trembled under her composure, in secret letters. She reminded the Vatican that no king could serve two masters, God and his own desire. Whispers grew into doubts. Cardinals in Rome began to question the purity of England's throne. Was King Henry VIII still the chosen defender of the faith? Or had he turned his crown into an altar for his own pride? The Queen never answered such questions directly. She only prayed longer, her rosary turning like a wheel of quiet vengeance. While the Church measured the soul of the king, another storm gathered within his court. Anne Boleyn appeared, sharp as a mirror held to the light. She was everything Elizabeth Blount had not been. Clever where the other was gentle, ambitious where the other was devout. Her presence cut through the air of the palace like perfume mixed with poison. Henry's eyes turned from memory to desire once more. And with that, the child who had once symbolized hope became an inconvenience. During a royal feast, Anne Boleyn watched the boy from across the room. FitzRoy, still not yet grown, stood beside his father, his posture proud and certain. Anne lifted her cup, the ruby wine catching the candlelight, and whispered to a lady near her, "He looks too much like his father." Then she drank, her lips curving into a smile that hid a prophecy. Outside the hall, servants whispered of alliances, priests debated sin, and the Queen prayed in the dark corners of her chapel. One woman had been exiled for giving birth to a son. Another now plotted her ascent through the same sin denied to her. Between them, the throne trembled. The mother who had given England a living heir was fading from history, and the woman who could not give one prepared to rewrite it with blood. The year turned heavy with omens. The court smelled of fear and incense, and the bells of London rang not for celebration, but for endings. In the same season that Queen Anne Boleyn was led to the scaffold, Henry FitzRoy began to wither behind closed doors. He was 17, beloved in name but forgotten in presence. Servants said the boy had caught a fever, that the damp air of England had crept into his lungs. Yet others whispered that the sickness came too suddenly, that it arrived the very week his stepmother's crown fell into dust. At first it was only coughing, quiet and brief. Then the sound deepened, breaking through the nights like the echo of distant drums. The physicians brought powders and prayers, yet nothing calmed the burning inside him. When he coughed, the linen stained red, but the scent was strange, almost sweet, like crushed roses left too long in the sun. Those who tended to him said the room carried a fragrance that did not belong to death, and they avoided his bed after dark. The king visited once, stood beside his son, and left without speaking. The next morning he forbade any mention of illness in the palace. As FitzRoy weakened, letters were sent to his mother in Lincolnshire. She never saw them. Each message was stopped by the king's own council, who said the Queen's household did not wish for disturbance. Yet Bessie felt it all the same. One night she woke to the sound of bells in the wind and knew her child was dying far away. She wrote a letter filled with prayers and forgiveness, sealed it with wax, and sent it north. It arrived too late. The boy was already gone. No state funeral followed. No choir sang. The court moved on as if nothing had happened. At dawn, a single white coffin was carried through the mist toward Thetford Priory. No banners, no procession, only the soft sound of hooves and rain. Inside the coffin lay the body of the king's only acknowledged son, dressed in a robe of silver thread that caught no light. In the countryside, Bessie kept a candle burning for 7 nights. The letter she had sent was returned unopened, its seal unbroken. It rested beside the ring her son had worn as a child. The wind that passed her window carried the faint scent of roses, the same fragrance that had filled his final breath. He was the only son who carried his father's name, yet the only one forbidden to die as a prince. Years passed, and the palace forgot the name that had once made it tremble. Bessie Blount lived far from London, in the quiet countryside of Lincolnshire, where the air was filled with the smell of rain and soil. She remarried, as the court expected her to a kind man of gentle manners, and together they built a life that was proper and small. Yet the villagers who passed her gate still whispered her story, calling her not by her title, but by a name that clung to her like a stain. They called her the mother of the sin. In the quiet of her house, she learned to live among ghosts. She tended a small garden, walked along the fields where the wind carried the echo of church bells from far away, and spoke little of the world she once knew. When the servants mentioned the royal court, she only smiled faintly, as if the memories belonged to someone else. Her beauty had softened, her laughter had faded, but her eyes still carried the same calm that once drew a king. Each night she performed a ritual that no one understood. On the table beside her bed lay a small silver ring and a folded piece of parchment bound with a red ribbon. The ring bore the name FitzRoy engraved in letters so fine they seemed to breathe in the moonlight. When darkness settled, she would place the ring upon the window ledge and open the shutters just enough for the moon to touch it. She believed the light would carry her son's spirit across the fields, that somewhere in its pale glow he might look back and remember her face. Servants spoke of strange nights when they heard her whisper softly to the wind, speaking as if to someone unseen. They never entered the room when she prayed, for the air within seemed sacred and heavy, like the pause before tears. One evening in late autumn, as the leaves fell and the earth smelled of rain, a maid passing her door heard her speak in her sleep. The words were faint but clear, carried by the rhythm of breath that hovered between dream and confession. My son had his father's eyes, but not his mercy. The maid crossed herself and left without sound. In the morning, Bessie sat by the window, the ring resting in her palm, her gaze lost beyond the mist. The sun rose slowly over the fields, lighting the frost upon the glass. She smiled once, thin and peaceful, as if the world had finally forgiven her for the life she had carried in secret. The court would never mention her name again, yet in that quiet house of Lincolnshire, history still breathed through a single candle, a silver ring, and a mother who had loved a king and borne the proof of both his pride and his curse. King Henry VIII grew old beneath the weight of his own legend. The thunder of his youth had faded into the rasp of a man surrounded by ghosts. His body, once proud and golden, had turned heavy and unyielding. The ulcers on his legs ached with each breath, and his eyes, dim behind the fog of years, wandered over a map of his kingdom spread upon the table before him. His fingers traced the borders of England, as if searching for the life that once pulsed within its veins. Around him hung portraits of wives and heirs, none of whom had given him the peace he sought. The blood he had fought to preserve was thinning, turning against itself, running out. He thought of Henry FitzRoy, the boy who had carried his name and his pride, the only son he had ever dared to call his own. That boy was gone before manhood, taken in the same season that another crown fell into the dust. FitzRoy's death had sealed the silence between heaven and the throne. and from that silence rose the curse that would haunt the Tudor line. The irony grew clearer with time. The sons and daughters born of secrecy, denied by royal decree, lived on to shape the realm he left behind. Among them were the children of Mary Boleyn, a woman once cast aside from his court. They grew in quiet strength, serving Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the queen who had paid for ambition with her life. The court of Elizabeth glittered with their presence, cousins by rumor, loyal by blood. They stood near the throne as though fate itself had chosen to remember what the crown had tried to forget. The courtiers called it providence. The priests called it irony. Yet it was something far simpler and far crueler. The blood they hid became the blood that survived. The bastards of the past became the foundation of the future. The royal line that had been built upon fire and faith was now held together by the children of silence. In the end, the dynasty King Henry VIII created outlived him not through the heirs he crowned, but through those he never claimed. His body was buried with ceremony, but his legacy lingered in the whispers of the women he had cast aside and the children born beyond the blessing of the church. Far from London, in the damp air of Lincolnshire, the grave of Elizabeth Blount rested beneath the shade of an old yew. Moss crept over her name until it was barely visible, and mist gathered in the mornings like breath upon stone. Yet if one listened closely, the wind still carried a faint echo, the memory of a woman who gave a king his only son, and in doing so, lost herself to history. History remembers kings by their crowns, but the crown itself was born from a woman who never wore it. If you believe the throne was built on silence and sin, subscribe to our channel, where every royal secret bleeds again.